Hello there, and welcome to episode 3 of my presidential series, episode 3 of the story of George Washington. Now, by the way, if you notice, I'm not wearing a tie today. It is hot. It is like 85 degrees out there here in Miami. This garage has no AC, so hey, I'm doing what I can. If you hear a little buzzing, it's a little fan I got on the side. Anyway, we're going to talk about the French and Indian War. Episode 1, we talked about George Washington's beginnings. We kind of like bypassed the French and Indian War. I'm doing a separate episode because it's very important. If the French and Indian War had not happened, it's very possible that the American Revolution might not have happened. So we have to dwell on this, and it caused quite an impression on Washington himself. Two things I want you to keep in mind. George Washington was 20 years old when he joined the participated in the French and Indian War. Erase from your brain that image you have of the $1 bill of Washington with his white hair and this old fart that you see there. Any 20-year-old boy that you know, brother, son, friend, neighbor, is closer to the George Washington of back then than the George Washington that you see on that dollar bill. So erase that image. He's 20 years old, young, an exceptional young man, but he's still just a young man. Another thing, Washington was very ambitious. He started making money as a surveyor in his teens. 20 years old, he joins the British military, and he wants a military commission. Keep that in mind. He really wants a military commission. Having a military commission means you are a gentleman, you're part of a club. It's like being an Ivy League student or graduate. You're part of something. He wanted that. It wasn't all, show me the money. No, he wanted that prestige, and he was looking for it. You could buy a military commission, but it still has to be approved by the British. So Washington was trying to merit this commission. So going into it, he's 20 years old, he joins the military. While he's in the military, the governor of Virginia needs somebody to go out there and speak to the French. Now, I forgot to mention, the reason that there was a conflict between the French and the British was the British had their 13 colonies. The French had built their colonies over North America. The Ohio Valley, the French were building trading posts in the Ohio Valley that the British felt belonged to them. They felt the French were encroaching on that area. So, Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie, he needed somebody to go to the Ohio Valley, walk from Virginia to Ohio, and speak to the French commander there and tell them basically to leave. And Washington, 20 years old, says, send me, I'll go. Which gives you an idea of how ambitious he was. Now, he was an exceptional young man, 6'2", and he must have made an impression because they did send him. They prepared a party together. They sent Washington out to speak to this French commander, and he went. Now, what happened? When he got there with his party, he spoke to the French commander. The French commander was very polite, invited him to dinner, but basically told Washington, no, we're not leaving. Gave him a note, written notification of the same. Washington leaves. Now, Washington splits his party in two. One group goes back to Virginia with the supplies. Washington keeps one aide, and he's going to move by himself. Along the way, they meet a Native American. The Native American tells them, hey, I know a shortcut. So they follow the Native American. Now, this Native American, at one point, turns around with his rifle or musket and shot at Washington and the aide and missed. Now, Washington freezes, but the aide runs up, puts a gun right up to the Native American, but Washington stops him and says, do not shoot him. It would cause a war between the British and the Native Americans, the Indians they call them. That might have been a mistake. The Native American ran off, and Washington and his aide said, oh crap, this guy's going to alert his buddies. So they start rushing. They get to this lake that's frozen. Washington falls through the ice. The aide rescues him. They spend the night shivering somewhere. The next day, the lake froze over. They walk across it, and they get back. The stories were written, some by Washington. His account made him look very heroic, that he braved the elements, that he got attacked by Indians, and all of this. So his prestige comes up. But anyway, in this prestige, he gets a position in the British military, and they send him out there to build a fort near some trading posts they wanted to build. They send Washington and some troops to protect this area so they could build some forts. Washington goes. He goes with a Native American named Tanak Arison. Tanak Arison is a member of the Mingo Nation, tribe, if you want to call it, but the Mingo Nation. Harrison and Washington become friends. They go there. They discover that the French had built their own forts near the area. So they attack the French at that fort. When they attack, it was a very short battle. The French were asleep. They capture a bunch of them. The French commander, his name was Jumonville. Remember that. Jumonville was wounded, and Washington wanted to speak to Jumonville. Now, we don't know what happened. There's two stories, basically. There's several stories, but two main ones. One is that a musket ball had hit Jumonville in the head and killed him while he was speaking to Washington. Another story is that Harrison, who hated the French, as soon as Jumonville started speaking to Washington, Harrison rushed forward with a tomahawk, split Jumonville's head open, washed his hands with the brains. If this is true, and it very might well be, if this is true, that must have freaked out Washington. But anyway, what happened? It turned out that Jumonville was a French ambassador, at least the French said so. And this began the French and Indian War. It probably would have happened anyway, but the French needed an excuse, and this caused it. So now, the French and Indian War was basically a global conflict. They didn't just fight in North America. They fought over there in Europe, where they didn't call it the French and Indian War. They called it the 7 Years' War. They fought over in Europe. They even fought near India and Newfoundland, up in Canada. So what happened? Okay, after this, Washington builds the fort, by the way, FortNecessity. And Harrison doesn't want to help him. He doesn't want to stay with Washington. He says that fort's a piece of crap. It's flimsy. The French will attack us and we'll die. It's suicide. Washington goes along. Harrison doesn't help him. By the way, Harrison dies a few months later of pneumonia. But Washington is in the fort. The French attack. Washington and his men surrender. They take Washington in, they have him sign a document. So we're going to let you go, but we need you to sign something. Washington brings an interpreter. It's a Dutch man. This Dutch man, something was lost in translation, but basically Washington signed some documents and left. What happened? This document actually said that Washington was admitting that he had killed the French ambassador Jumonville. Now, I really sincerely believe Washington didn't sign this knowingly. Later on, the British blamed him. Crap, you started the French and Indian War. Washington said, no, I signed that unknowingly. I didn't know what I was signing. But that gave the French the excuse. That gave the British a person to blame. The French and Indian War would have happened anyway. But in the meantime, it puts Washington in a very, very bad light. Okay, so what happens? He kind of gets demoted. And remember, he's looking for this military commission. He goes out on skirmishes. They send him to raid Indian towns or Native American towns. Washington, by this point, admired the British for their training. He lost respect for the small militias that Virginia had. The British had one strong army, strong training. They believed in corporal punishment. There was whippings. There were gauntlets. That gauntlet means that if you do something like sleeping on your watch, they get 40 men, 20 on each side in rows. You walk between them and they hit you with clubs and ropes and whatever. There were executions. There were all these sorts of things. And Washington liked that and actually carried that forward to the American Revolution. He believed in harsh discipline, and he started disciplining his Virginia militia very strongly the British way. It was very successful, by the way. Going on, so Washington participates in these raids on Native American towns, and they were brutal. Washington was pretty brutal. When I get to the part where he becomes president, he becomes more lenient to the Native Americans, very much so. But as a 20-year-old man, when they sent him out there to do this, he did his duty. And when they go to villages, that means displace everybody, kill a bunch of people, and burn the village down. Going on, in 1755, he became an aide to General Edward Braddock. British commander, General Braddock. General Braddock was going to, had a plan to go out there and attack the French, and when they got to, they called this the Battle of Monongahela. I hope I pronounced that right. When they get around the area, General Braddock had 1,500 men. They get ambushed, they get attacked by the French. French are outnumbered. British had 1,500 men, I don't know how many the French had. But the French are hiding behind trees and fences. Now, by this point, Washington understood the Native American way of battle, and he understood what the French and the Indians were doing, and he was telling General Braddock advice do it this way, do it that way, we're getting ambushed. No, Braddock was used to the British way, stuck to it, but they got ambushed. In a nutshell, of the 1,500 men, 1,000 died. And during all of this, Washington's on his horse riding back and forth. Now get this, a horse was shot out from under him. After the battle, there were 4 bullet holes in his coat, 1 in his hat. Another horse was shot out from under him. They managed to escape, and him and a British soldier named Thomas Gage, remember that name later on, they escaped, and with the men. So he had to lead the retreat of 500 men. Okay. During all of this, Washington, year after year, is still seeking his commission. He participates bravely in many, many battles. Many skirmishes. I mentioned the Native American towns that were raided, fighting against the French. He gets very, very, very sick. And he was complaining also because it turned out that a British sergeant is over a colonial captain. In other words, just for being British born out there in England, you're considered a higher rank than even a higher ranking officer per se in title if you're a colonial. So he was very much against that. He wasn't getting his commission. He got very, very sick. He got dysentery. And even though he was ill, he did participate in some battles, but at some points he couldn't. He was afraid of getting that he had tuberculosis, which is what must have been scary because his brother died of tuberculosis. Anyway, years later, he participated in the Forbes expedition. They were going to attack Fort Duquesne, French fort, and while they were getting in that area, Washington was head of one British unit. There was another British unit nearby. Now there was fog. What happened? Both British units thought that the other was a French unit. They start shooting at each other. Today we call that friendly fire. Washington and his men are shooting at another British unit. The British are shooting at each other. And when Washington realizes what's happening, he gets on his horse, he starts riding between both units, trying to tell everybody, I don't know if they said cease fire back then, but basically that's what he wanted to say. Stop. By the time it was over, there were about, 14 dead and 26 wounded. Okay. Shortly after, I should mention that Fort Duquesne was taken. It was a big British victory. And it pretty much sealed the fate of the French. The French lost. British won. There was a treaty signed a couple of years later on this. But in the meantime, George Washington left the British military. 7 years he was out there. He was bitter. He never got his military commission. I mentioned he had dysentery. He went off and married Martha Washington and lived happily in Mount Vernon. He did learn a lot, though, from the French and Indian War. He learned tactics that the British had. He learned tactics that the Native Americans had. He learned about training, discipline, logistics, how to use corporal punishment. These are many, many things that helped him in the American Revolution years later. Unfortunately, this was wilderness fighting. So during the American Revolution, there were battles fought in towns that didn't quite help him that much. It also taught him a lot of patience because he was writing letters after letters, trying to get the commission, but he ran into a lot of frustrating episodes when it came to the British bureaucracy. So anyway, he feels that his whole military venture was a failure. He goes off to Mount Vernon to live a different kind of life. And again, several years later came, of course, the American Revolution, which we will study in a separate episode. So in the meantime, give me your comments. Better yet, subscribe. But anyway, this is John Franquez, ending episode 3 of George Washington. Thank you.